Hello, good morning. This is Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Ansari, Department of Political Science, Aligarh Muslim University. Today I am going to talk about one of the very important concepts in political science, that is the concept of state. Now, state itself is a central of study in political science, and its presence is so it's ubiquitous, and the power of the state which shapes the conditions that our all life, right from the childhood to adult and to our death, is completely controlled by state. So our interaction with the state begins with much before we even gain awareness of it. For example, the registration of our birth, we travel on roads, the police, board exams, certificates, voter identity cards, passports. So these are a few instances of a routine encounter with the state, which points to the pervasiveness of the modern state in our daily lives. State compels us to do certain things and to refrain from doing certain others. Besides, it aims to provide us with basic protection against an attack on ourselves or our possessions, and also restrain and regiments us in several ways in doing the same to others. It provides us with wide range of benefits in the form of healthcare, education, roads, telephone, parks, movies, etc. So Christopher Morris, he points out to the omnipresence of state in our lives by saying in an adaptation of Leon Trotsky's quip about war, when he says, "You may not be interested in the state, but the state is certainly interested in you." Now, the very first question that we need to find out, and it comes to our mind, is what is state? Now, statehood refers to not merely a set of institutions, but also a body of attitudes, practices, and codes of behavior that we follow consciously, willingly at times, and unconsciously and unwillingly at others. Now, these codes of behavior could encompass obedience of state laws or obligatory voting in elections, compulsory military training or conscription. The state is the most important concern of modern political theory. And the concepts that we study in political theory, like rights, democracy, equality, liberty, justice, are all based on relationship between state and those who are living within it, that is, the citizens. Now, for this reason, we need to be familiar with the idea of and the functions of state. The state and the government are not coincidental. Modern political thinkers of different political persuasion will agree with what Max Weber said, the German sociologist, that the one common element of all modern states is the monopoly over the legitimate use of force within a common territory. Now, Weber also stresses on three more important elements. One is territoriality, second is the monopoly of the means of physical violence, and third is legitimacy. Now, out of these three, the third word, legitimacy, something that needs to be elaborated. So, what does legitimacy mean? Now, legitimacy is derived from the Latin word legimere, which means to legitimate and signifies a rightfulness in a broader sense. It confers a binding or authoritative character on an order, thus transforming power into authority. So the state has the authority to ensure that its laws are obeyed and powers to punish those who disobey those laws. Authority may be of various kinds, but here we are more concerned with the question of state and the political authority that it has. So the state is what we are discussing. So for robbers, for instance, can have the power to harm us, yet have no authority because his power is neither legally nor morally rightful. So there is no authority involved, which is the rightful use of the power. So, what gives the state this right to rule over us? And why are we obligated to obey the state? Now, this is a problem that has preoccupied several political thinkers and is known as political obligation. So, an obligation is duty to act in a particular way. Political obligation necessitates obedience to the laws of the state. Now, we are often made to accept the laws of the state as binding on us, be it the traffic rules or the rules regarding marriage or the trade or the property. We obey more the state because it promotes our happiness than any other alternative political organization. And alternatively, we could justify our obligation on the ground that we ourselves have consented to the state on the basis of social contract. And it is this very reason that binds us to obey the laws of the state. Now, talking about the modern state, the Montevideo Convention on Rights and Duties of the State in 1933, it put forth what is widely regarded as the classical legal definition of the state. And according to it, state must possess the following: a permanent population, a defined territory, and a government capable of maintaining effective control over the corresponding territory and of conducting international relations with other states. Now, recognition by other states was often seen to be crucial because it implied acceptance into the international community. However, these definitions, these definitions are not absolute, and particularly this one. For instance, international law does not necessitate settled boundaries or frontiers to accord recognition to the state. So when we talk about the state, we are referring to a whole gamut of different organized institutions that are connected to one another and enjoy some cohesion. That is, the state is organizationally highly differentiated as well as centralized. Thus, it is not a monolithic structure. It consists of a set of institutions and organizations. So, the three main arms of the modern state are the judiciary, executive, and the legislature. Now, each different but with a certain level of cohesion with each other. The different arms of the state exercise the authority that they have, not on their own behalf, but on the basis of the authority, excuse me, they are entitled to as part of the state. So the government refers to the administrative organ of the state and is constrained by the constitution of the state. So government may change, but the state persists. Now, when we talk about modern state, the state as a concept depends on the values that are derived from the political, cultural, religious, and economic context of a particular time. The word state, which is derived from Latin word stare, that is to stand, and more specifically from status, a standing or condition. The word state refers to the modern state, a form of political organization that could be said to have evolved in the early modern Europe and was transmitted primarily through colonialism to other parts of the world. Thus, the modern state and the modern system of state have not been permanent and universal feature of human history. Further, we can say that the trajectory of development of state in other parts of the world has been very different from what it was in Europe. So many political philosophers point out that the idea of modern state could be traced to the late medieval ages, especially in the writings of Niccolo Machiavelli, who is often credited with first using the concept of the state stato, that is to refer to a territorial sovereign government, in his work Prince, which was published in 1537. So when Machiavelli talks about political power, he begins and ends with one individual, that is the prince, who is sovereign. So the state means the prince's state. So in Western political theory, it is with Hobbes that the theorization of the power moves on to an abstract or non-human entity, the modern sovereign state. Now, what is distinctive about the modern state in terms of its difference from earlier kingship is the distinction between the rulers and the office and institutions they occupy. Thus, the term modern state is characterized by its impersonal standing. The current holder of power in the government do not constitute the state. The state exists before they came to power and continues to be there after they leave. It aims to gain autonomy from the contending parties or groups that come to hold political power, or political power state is said to be abstracted from the power holders. The modern state is a public order distinct from and located above both the ruler and the ruled. The Peace Treaty of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648 concluded a series of religious wars among the main European powers and led an undermining of the power of the church, giving the king authority over his own realm. It led to the strengthening of the new conception of international law based on the principle of all states as equal, have an equal right to self-determination. So the earlier dispersed political authority was replaced by what would eventually lead to the centralized modern authority, and the state came to be the source of political authority. Now, such political authorities are born with the another component, that is sovereignty. So, sovereignty refers to the state being the ultimate source of political authority within the territory under its jurisdiction. So, there are two sets of sovereignty, internal and external. Internal sovereignty refers to the fact that within its boundaries, there are no authorities higher than the state. State is supreme, and a citizen cannot appeal against the state to any other authority. The state has the right to make binding decisions upon the citizens and upon those who enter its territory. The modern state is territorially biased. So, this means that the state exercises authority within its territorial borders, which are acknowledged by other states. Now, this acknowledgement distinguishes state from other forms of political organizations, where governance is over people rather than over land. People's allegiance are not territorially determined. So one's rights and duties depend on one's place in hierarchical social order within a tribe or a clan or other forms of ethnic organization. So modern state has no authority outside its borders. No other state possesses authority within another state's border. So, within the boundaries of the state, there is a single system of governance distinct from others that operate externally. So, the territorial foundations of the state distinguishes it from other types of organizations and associations, which could be religious. So, the demands for statehood by groups are often for the recognition of the claims to territory. Now, we need to distinguish between state, society, and nation to understand what state stands for. So, the state is distinct from the civil society. The former is representative of coercion, while the latter, that is the civil society, is said to be based on voluntary participation. States, they vary in the amount of independence that they permit to other institutions, that is the civil society. So a nation could be defined as a community feeling among people who recognize that they are distinct from other communities and they wish to control their own affairs. Now, this distinction could be based on their possession of a common language, or could be common religion, political values and attitudes, or a sense of having done things together in the past and a desire to do things together in the future. The entire population in the same state shares this feeling, giving rise to the concept of nation state. Now, this is not the case with all the states in the world today. So, the nation and the state do not coincide. There are people who feel part of the same nation that are spread over different states. Like, for example, presently, the Kurdish people, for instance, are spread across Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, and are considered themselves to be a nation. A question that concerns contemporary political philosophers is whether all the people who consider themselves to be a nation can demand statehood or whether they are entitled to statehood. Now, if we see the justification for state, why we should have a state at all. So, the necessity or otherwise of the state is often based on a belief concerning our human nature and our knowledge about human nature. Now, while one could not automatically move from a premise that human nature to a theory of state, there is usually some kind of relationship between human nature and the structure of political arrangements. One could even say that those who have argued for a strong centralized tendency in the state and those who have argued for greater power of the state are usually those who view human nature with distrust. Now, in this category, we place contractualists like Thomas Hobbes, who viewed human beings as naturally selfish and went on to argue that the necessary solution for this problem was absolute sovereignty. Other hand, Locke himself, who was also from the same country and same period of time, he viewed human nature differently. He found human nature to be peace loving. So he here approved of a government that is constitutional in nature, and he imposed certain restrictions on the state to follow certain rules that they have all agreed upon in the form of a constitution. Similarly, in uh, in the 20th century, Mahatma Gandhi, he had a much more optimistic and generous view of human nature. And he believed that though human beings were a combination of good and bad qualities, they could become good and act responsibly, even in the absence of the coercive apparatus of the state. So, human nature influences and justifies our reason for having state, and state has its reason d'etre in being there where it is. So, there is another perspective. The contractualist, as I was talking about, they do believe in a contract giving legitimacy to the state itself. So for Hobbes, given his assumptions of human nature as selfish, the state of nature was a state of war itself against all. So there is no higher authority with the power to command people's obedience or with the responsibility of protecting their interest or possessions. So Thomas Hobbes argued that this kind of a situation necessitated the setting of a common power to protect us from another and from external threat. Now, this implied that the state emerged from a contract that individuals in a state of nature consented to in order to protect themselves and one another and from external threats. The social contract argument asserts that the state emerged from our individual consent, and only our consent can bind us to obedience. So we are bound to obey the law of the state most of the time because it has emerged out of our consent, which is voluntarily given. John Locke and Rousseau, who are other contractualists in the same tradition, and Immanuel Kant further, he used to occupy the concept of contract as the reason for obedience to state, and the very concept of social contract that it's coming up in the mind of people is the difference which it creates for us to justify the state. So Immanuel Kant used the concept of the social contract and came up with a different answer on what the government is obligated to do and what the citizens are obligated to obey. The social contract is not a historical event. The critics of social contract have argued that since it is fictitious, it has no moral or political force. To this, Kant replies that the idea of contract is important, even if no actual contract exists. He put forth the idea that if an arrangement is such that free individual could not have agreed to it, then it is unjust. So the social contract argument bases political obligation on our consent to the state. Now this consent could be expressed or could not be expressed, be in the form of tacit support. Now there are another sets of philosophers who justify the existence of the state or our obligation towards it in the form of a utility. So state is justified because of its utility in bringing about greatest good to the greatest number. Or alternatively, the political arrangement. We could then be concurring with utilitarianism, which has two basic claims. First, that human happiness and well being are important, and second, that we assess and act purely by its consequences. Now, this is why utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. Early utilitarian philosophers like Germany Bentham and James Mill, they believed that the consequences one should consider were the happiness and unhappiness that one's action would cause. If you put the two claims together, we could say that utilitarianism aims to bring about a state of affair that results in the greatest happiness of the greatest number. For the utilitarian, the state is justified on the ground that it brings about greater and more happiness than any alternative political arrangement. The justification of the state in this case is based on its utility and not on consent, as the social contract argument would assert. Now, what kind of state? That is another area, another aspect of state that needs to be looked into. Whether it is neutral or whether it is class kind or some other kind, that is what we are going to talk about. So, liberals believe that the state is a neutral arbiter between different competing interests and stand to realize what is called the common good in society. So, the neutrality of the state is linked to the idea of moral equality of individuals, which could be based on any of the following grounds. Would be their ability to think, to feel, to make choices. So the emphasis here is on the capacity and the ability and not the actual exercise. So even if we do not actually exercise these capacities right now, we do possess them as individuals. So this makes the liberal argue that individuals are entitled to equal respect from the state. Respect for an individual implies respect for his or her ability to make choices as well as for the choices. So difference in capabilities are not sufficient ground for the state to treat an individual as inferior to others. Citizens are entitled to equal respect and concern from the state because the state is committed to respect the moral equality of citizens, which means non-discrimination and impartiality at the very first level. So the state should not arbitrarily discriminate in its treatment of one citizen against other. Liberals believe that the state should seek to ensure that each individual has the freedom to exercise his or her choice. The best state of affairs, according to them, is the set of rules or the framework that would best ensure that government treats its citizens with equal respect and not impose any conception of what good life is. Thus, for liberals, the state is concerned with rules that would enable individuals to pursue their own ideas and ideals of what they think is good life, so long as the freedom of others is not infringed upon. So that is what state should be, according to the liberals. Now, another tradition which talks about the state, how it should be. So, liberals' view of the state as a neutral arbiter among conflicting interests is challenged by Marxists. So, Marxism offers a method of evaluating the ideas and practices of the state in its day to day affairs. And to understand their view of state, it is important that we begin by explaining the materialistic concept of history or historical materialism, which assumes that human history progresses through contradictions or dialectics at the level of the production of goods in society. So Karl Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels borrowed the concept of dialectic method from the German philosopher Friedrich Hegel, and he, in fact, got inspiration from ancient Greeks who used dialectic as a form of argumentation through questions and answer, and thus an argumentative technique involved contradictory. So Hegel maintained that history was in the form of development and conflict of abstract principles that include culture, religion, philosophies. So there was always tension between the present state of affairs and what it was becoming. Thus, every state of affair contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction and transformation to a higher stage. Such and each successive stage was a progress beyond those that have preceded and contain elements from them. This could be represented by thesis, which is opposed to antithesis, which is consequentially produced as synthesis. So Marx took up the concept of this dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that is through which the process through which development in a society takes place. But instead of abstract principles, he focused on the changing economic base of the society and the social class to which it gave rise. For Marx, conflict between these classes were the causes of the changes taking place in human history. So historical materialism maintains that the key to change in society lies in the way human begins uh, produce goods in common. So production is the real foundation or the base of the society. So history is the record of increasingly sophisticated ways of producing goods. So developments in production lead to a change in the economic structure, which in turn leads to change in the superstructure, that is political, religious, legal, and philosophical values. So the division of society into two classes, those who own the means of production, that is the land and the instrument of production, and those who are direct producers like slaves, peasants, or wage laborers. The exploitation of the direct producers of the owners, direct producers by the owners of the means of production lead to a conflict between these two classes. So economic structure therefore determines whether the state exists, and if so, what kind of state it is. It maintains that it was illusory to hold that the state has a universal character that could harmonize the discordant elements of civil society. According to him, as long as the society is divided into classes on the basis of ownership of means of production, there would be a dominant class and an exploited class, and the state would conduct its business in a manner conducive to the interest of the dominant class. So the state is not referred to only as an instrument of dominant class. Therefore, and nevertheless, it is important to remember the autonomy of the state is only relative and not absolute. So while appearing to mediate between competing class interests, the state keeps the class structure intact. So state is not a neutral arbiter, but acts to maintain the division of society into classes. So far, we have seen the Marxism focusing on the coercive role of the state. The state is essentially institution whereby a dominant exploiting class imposes and defends its powers and privileges against the class and classes that it dominates and exploits. Now, Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, introduced into Marxism, taught the ideas that it is not just through an open coercion that the domination of the ruling class is secured, it is also elicited through ideological manipulation. So, according to Gramsci, the state is force plus consent, or hegemony and coercion, in which civil society provides consent and political society organizes force. So, hegemony refers to the ability of the dominant class to secure the consent of those it dominates. So, it's a process through which the bourgeoisie maintain its dominant position in society. The system of education, the mass media. Now, these are parts of what could be called ideological state apparatus. Now, there is another perspective, another tradition which talks about what a state looks like, how it is, and that is the patriarchal way, that is feminist way of looking at things. So, liberal feminists who are generally they subscribe to the belief of state's basic neutrality, that is the denial of legal and political equality to women, would imply that the laws of the state are biased in favor of men. Yet it is possible to rectify these laws by the intervention of the state. So they therefore see the state as capable of playing a role in promoting equality between men and women. Now, this is evident from many campaigns, for instance, the demand for reservation of seats in parliament for women, the extension of welfare schemes for women. So, with that, the liberal feminism belief in the basic neutrality of the state and the possibility of appealing to the state to remove the legal and political inequality between the sexes is possible. Now, another stream of feminism, that is radical feminism, believes that the power of the state is a reflection of patriarchal nature of society. So, they question the idea of the basic neutrality of the state, for they view the state as a reflection of patriarchal values in society. And the radical feminist, for them, the origin and the roots of disparity between male and female, men and women, lies within the family. So, in the organization of labor within the family, the state is believed to be an instrument of male power. So, Catherine McKinnon has argued that in a liberal state, it is through law that women's subordination and silence are maintained. In an unequal society, the definition of the normal status of the women is determined by the application of male values and practices. Thus, radical feminism criticizes the views of the state as impartial and neutral. Now we move on to the next tradition, that is what state is. It is considered governmentality. So the government is here considered by this perspective is as an administrative apparatus of the state. However, according to Michael Foucault, the French philosopher, the state is a result of the practice of the government. Now, Foucault was interested in how modernity was marketed by the emergence of the broader field of a government of human conduct, of the self, of the family, of the institution, of the body. He maintained that the state is a result of this tendency towards the government of conduct. So rather than saying that the state is the condition for the existence of government, he turned around saying that the state flows from this modern practice of ordering life into structures, something that was not common in the Middle Ages. So Foucault saw governmentality as a rationale of governing that takes the form of a series of mundane daily practices and social ordering. So the concept of state is basically understood through different traditions differently. Its justification and the reason for having the state, and it's the way it looks, whether it is a central idea based on power, or why should we as a citizens should follow it, or based on consent, or it is a class structure where the dominant and the dominated classes are made to remain that way, and state does not act as a neutral arbiter to bring about any kind of reconciliation. Now, these are different perspectives and different traditions to look at the concept of state. With that, I come to the end of the lecture. Thank you for watching. Thank you.